Hondas. Some people love them, some people would literally love nothing more than to watch the entire company just burn to the ground. But regardless of your standpoint on Honda, there's absolutely no denying the fact that in the past 40 years or so, they have made a huge impact in the automotive industry as well as car culture. Now, while everyone watching this has heard of models like the Civic, Integra, CRX, S2000, etc., there's definitely a bunch of much lesser known models out there that I still think are very cool in their own right and definitely deserve to be noted. So for this video, I decided to compile a list of unique, rare, or low-key performance model Hondas that I'm pretty sure you may have never heard of.
Oh, I've heard of every single one of these models. I see them every single day. My neighbor has 3 of them.
Okay, look. I read my analytics, okay? 90% of my viewership takes place in North America. None of these cars are sold in North America. So if you happen to live in an Asian or European country or Oceania and you happen to see these things on a semi-regular basis, don't at me. Also, if you happen to catch me looking down a few times in this video, it's because I have notes, and that's because when I'm putting myself in front of the camera and I need to talk about stuff, I can't remember jack shit. So let's get started.
The new Concerto. Quiet power. Engineered by Honda.
First model we have on this list is the Honda Concerto? Concerto? Thank you. The Honda Concerto. Concerto was produced from 1988 to 1994, and it was offered with a variety of D-Series engines. Far too many to list for this video, but it ranged from the single-cam 1.4-liter D14A1 all the way up to the dual-overhead cam 1.6-liter D16 Z4, which if you didn't know, yeah, the D-Series was offered with single-cam and dual-overhead cam variants. It weighed 2,600 pounds. It can be had in a 5-speed manual or a 4-speed automatic. Now, the Concerto was conceived to replace the Accord hatchback as well as the 5-door Integra, and it was based on the then-existing Honda Civic, which was the EF. This car was produced in collaboration with the British car company Rover, and Rover badge engineered it into being the Rover 200 and Rover 400. And if you didn't know, Rover had a very close relationship with Honda throughout the 80s and 90s, and they collaborated on a wide variety of vehicles. Now, what I find interesting about this car, why I included it on this list, is I just think it's a pretty cool looking car. It really stands out from the rest of the Hondas that were available throughout the 80s and 90s. And it does kind of resemble the 5-door Integra that it's replacing, but the sloped liftback design is definitely much more pronounced than the Integra had. Overall, I just think it's a pretty cool, sporty looking car, especially after they facelifted it and everything was kind of smoothed out and the edges were rounded off a little bit more. Kind of looks like a hybrid between a Accord and a Civic thrown into a 5-door liftback body style. But also, I actually kind of think it looks like a Toyota. And not a bad thing. Toyota made some pretty cool looking cars back in the 1980s. Now, I had a pretty hard time finding any modified examples of this thing, but I imagine it being 2,600 pounds, if you throw in a B-Series or even a K-Series, it could be a pretty good project car. And with it being all-wheel drive, I even think it'd probably be a pretty cool rally car. But if you happen to live in Australia or wherever these things are sold, if you've ever seen any of these things modified, let me know in the comments. Also, just to make this car a little stranger, the Rover 200 was offered with a Peugeot diesel, which Hondas are really not known for having diesels, let alone French diesels, so I guess that's something to be noted. So moving on, we have what I think to be one of the coolest cars on this list, the Honda Accord Aerodeck. Now, honestly, I had a very hard time finding accurate technical details about this car, so moving forward, some of the things I say may not be 100% accurate, but is what I was able to scrape together and what I believe to be specific to this car. And I'll explain one of the reasons why I had a hard time finding information on it in a minute. But anyway, the Aerodeck was produced from 1986 to 1989, and it was offered with a A20 engine, possibly an A16, but it ranged from 98 horsepower to 122 horsepower, and I believe it weighed in around 2,400 pounds. Now, the reason I included this car on this list is because I think it's one of the coolest looking Hondas that we never got, and honestly, I think it's one of the coolest looking Hondas like ever built. Like, if you think about it, it looks like a larger EF hatch with pop-up headlights and a different rear end. And technically, it's classified as a shooting brake, so I guess it's the only Honda shooting brake to ever be made. Now, obviously, as I just said, this thing was never sold in North America. It was only sold in Europe and Japan, and as far as I know, it was produced in pretty low numbers, and it wasn't produced for that long. It was only produced for 4 years. Now, I actually was able to find a couple pictures of this thing modified, and it's just such a cool looking car. Like, it definitely looks really cool modified. It's definitely something I really wish was sold in the United States, but you know how it works. We don't get anything cool like ever. But here's the thing though, we did get a Accord Aerodeck. but the Accord Aerodeck over here was just the nameplate for the Accord station wagon. And that's one of the reasons why it was so hard to find information about this Accord Aerodeck, because when you type in Accord Aerodeck, at least in my region, all you find is stuff about the station wagon. You really don't find anything about the shooting brake. I mean, there's nothing wrong with Accord station wagons. I've seen some pretty dope looking Accord station wagons, but come on, I would much rather have this than the Accord station wagon. I think this thing would definitely make a really cool platform to make a race car or a show car or whatever. It would definitely stand out amongst everything else in the crowd.
I guess you're just gonna finish your walk.
Guess so.
美しく広くイノーバ
Next up we have the Honda Ascot CB2/CB4. This was produced from 1992 to 1996 and it was offered with a single cam and dual overhead cam F20A5, as well as the H23A, which produced 165 horsepower and it weighed in around 3,020 pounds. So it wasn't one of the lighter Hondas of the 90s. So I included this one the same reason as the last two. I just think it's a really cool, sporty looking car, even though it's not a sports car technically. But what I find interesting about it is that it just looks like a bunch of Hondas just mashed together. Like, if you look at the front, it looks like it has the headlights from an Integra, as well as the cosmetics from the Prelude of the time. And then the body kind of looks like an Accord and a Civic, and then you go around to the back end, it's kind of like its own unique thing. And it was actually based on the CB Accord of the time, but it's much more modern looking than the Accord that it was based off of. Now, I mentioned the Prelude a minute ago. It actually does have the same H23A from the Prelude that was sold in export markets, and it also has four-wheel steering. So if you really think about it, it is kind of a Prelude sedan. Definitely would have been cool to have this thing in the United States, but honestly, Honda probably wouldn't have been able to fit it into any market because they already had the Accord and the Civic, both offered in sedan variants, that probably wouldn't have sold that well. Now, the Ascot did continue after 1996, but it's kind of looking. So we just focus on this one, which I think is the best looking one that was produced during its lifespan. Alright, here's where we start getting into performance stuff. Next we have kind of a low-key Type R, and that is the Honda Torneo Euro R.
Euro R 誕生 Honda New Accord New Torneo.
So the Torneo was produced from 1997 to 2001, and the Euro R was offered with an H22A that produced around 220 horsepower, which for a naturally aspirated four-cylinder back in the 90s is a lot. And it was offered with a 5-speed manual and weighed around 3,060 pounds. So you might be wondering why you also saw the Accord Euro R in that little video that I just showed you, and that's because it's pretty much the same thing as an Accord Euro R, just like different cosmetics and some different like trim packaging. How Honda worked back in the 90s, they had a couple different dealer systems. They had Vero, Primo, and Clio. The Accord Euro R was sold at Honda Clio, and the Torneo was sold at Honda Vero and Honda Primo. So it was kind of like getting the H6 and the BRZ, but within the same brand. So, like its Accord variant, it was sold with Momo steering wheel, Recaro seats, Torsen limited slip diff, sports exhaust, and upgraded suspension. So this thing was a legit Type R. You know, it's a Euro R, but Euro R and Type R are pretty much the same thing. It was also sold with a navigation system that Honda called InterNavi, some internet-based navigation system. I can imagine how god-awful it must have been back in the late 90s, but regardless, if you got an Euro R, you got the navigation system. There was also an SIR variant, which, if you don't know, the SIR is like one step down from a Type R or Euro R, and that was sold with a 200 horsepower F20B with the 5-speed manual. It also came with an automatic, but if you got that, they robbed you of 20 horsepower, so they clearly wanted you to buy the manual in that case. So I kind of consider this like the hidden Type R of Honda, because like I didn't even know about the Torneo until a couple years ago, let alone the fact that it had a Euro R edition. But regardless of the fact that it's pretty much the same thing as an Accord Euro R, which most people know about, it is another Euro R, but so the fact that it exists is pretty cool. So next up, we have another little hidden performance gem from Honda, the Accord SIR wagon. So the SIR wagon was produced from 1999 to 2001. It came with an H23A, and it was offered in front-wheel drive and all-wheel drive variants. With the front-wheel drive variant, you got 200 horsepower, and with the all-wheel drive variant, they cut you 10 horsepower, so you got 190 horsepower. And it came in weighing around 2,932 pounds. Why I have this car on this list is because it's a performance wagon from Honda that I only found out about like 2 weeks ago. I think it's pretty dope, honestly. It's one of the few Hondas offered with all-wheel drive, and like I said, it's a performance wagon. Performance wagons are awesome. I'm just gonna point out here that during the Honda Accord 6th generation, Honda offered 3 different variants across the world. North America and Australia got their own variant. Europe got their own variant, and Japan got their own variant. So one of the cooler things to find about this car is actually the design cues. If you look at the back of it, it's a really dramatic slope back, almost kind of like a shuttle looking design. Much more dramatic looking than the wagon we got over here in the United States. In the 6th generation, we didn't even get a wagon in the United States. For a station wagon made in the late 90s, it's definitely a really unique looking design. The only unfortunate thing about this is that it was only offered with a 5-speed automatic, and I guess Honda's reasoning behind that was they probably saw it as like a practical SIR as opposed to the Civic SIR or the Torneo or Accord SIR. And they probably figured, since you're going for something more practical, and you're probably going to be driving in the city a lot, which everyone knows traffic in Japan is nightmarish, you're probably going to want an automatic over a manual. But it would have been cool to see this thing offered in a manual. I'm sure it wouldn't be hard to swap. Finally, we have the top off this list, as I think being the coolest one that I've included here so far, the Accord Type R. The Accord Type R was produced only in Europe from 1998 to 2002, and it was offered with an H22A7 that produced 209 horsepower, which was less than the Euro R. However, it only weighed 2,723 pounds, which was a lot lighter than the Accord Euro R. Like its siblings over in Japan, it was also offered with Recaro seats and Momo steering wheel, limited slip differential, upgraded exhaust and suspension, so all the Type R goodies you could possibly want. Honestly, I think that the Type R is much better looking than the Japanese Euro R. I think the design overall is just much cleaner looking, it's simpler, it's smoother. I just think it's an overall better looking car. From what I've heard, this thing is definitely no slouch. Like, it's a legit Type R. It handles well, it's very responsive. Again, it's lightweight, it's only 2,700 pounds. It's pretty much everything you could possibly want from a Honda Type R. The Accord Type R has it too. Also, it's a 4-door Type R, so you can have a practical Type R, which I think is pretty cool. And it has a pretty badass exhaust in it. This is definitely considered by many to be the forgotten Type R because apparently it didn't really sell that well, so there's not many of them really floating around in Europe. I can imagine it didn't sell well because most people just went straight to the Integra Type R. But overall, still a really solid car, definitely something I think should be remembered by more people. I think if you had the original PlayStation 1 Gran Turismos, you might remember this thing, because I'm almost positive the Accord Type R is featured in one of the early Gran Turismos. Alright, that's it for this video. It's something kind of new, something that I want to kind of experiment with. It's actually more so a twist on the original content that I used to make on this channel back in 2014, 2015, if you were around back then. But let me know what you guys thought. Have you heard of these Hondas? Have you not heard of them? What do you think of them? If there's any more manufacturers that you want me to cover or more types of cars that you want me to cover, let me know. I'm not just exclusively Hondas. But yeah, I will see you guys next week, which should be a car show video, probably the last one of the season. So I'm going to try to make that a banger. But other than that, I hope you guys have an awesome day, and I will see you next week.